There it is. Oh, hey there guys. Sorry, as much as I'd love to get a new video out, it's my favorite time of year. Halloween is uncontested as my absolute favorite holiday, and I'm actually on my way to go to a Halloween party. It's been kinda hard to meet people in recent years, so I guess I'm hoping that this will be a kickoff point for my adult social life. And well, with that, goodbye depth perception, hello new friends. They took me and then, you know what? To hell with them. I don't need a social life. I have 3 friends already. In fact, yeah, hey man, you wanna come over and make total asses of ourselves on the internet? What? What are you even supposed to be dressed as?
A ghost. Can't you tell?
Well, since you're over, what exactly do you want to do?
I don't know. I thought you'd have something in mind since you asked me to come over.
Well, dude, you busted in my house the second I called you.
That sounds like a you problem. Do you want to talk about Five Nights at Freddy's?
To say that Five Nights at Freddy's is popular is an understatement. As a series, it has done what very few game franchises have done, and transcended the medium to become a pop culture phenomenon.
It spawned loads of merchandise, from figures to plushies, its own little fanverse of game projects, and even a movie that looks pretty good.
We find it instrumental to know the history behind this series, to fully understand how crazy it is that something like Five Nights at Freddy's took off the way it did. And it all starts with the series creator, Scott Cawthon. Scott Cawthon is a Texas-based game developer who hadn't seen much success in his early years.
Scott, a dedicated Christian, made games related to his faith. Pilgrim's Progress is probably the most significant example, which was by no means a financial hit.
From there, due to the admittedly niche market of Christian games, he decided to expand into making family-friendly titles. Despite the change in direction, success didn't really come his way for a while. In fact, the opposite, as pretty much all of his games prior to Five Nights were massive flops.
The failure of his games isn't entirely surprising to us, but it does suck to see because a lot of his early games are pretty cool.
The Desolate Hope is the big one here. I think it has some of the most unique visuals in a game I've ever seen. It is absolutely gorgeous at times.
Despite his games unfortunately not being very successful, the most significant of his early works was Chipper & Sons Lumber Company.
Chipper & Sons is a weird game. It's a bit of a simulation title, but also like a minigame collection. I don't really know how to describe it. Land point. Is that a termite drinking a margarita? Oh my god. The reason that this is the most significant is because when this game was released, people took a massive shit all over it and were critical of every single aspect of the game. Most significantly, the visuals.
Online critics compared the game's characters to weird pizzeria animatronics, a la Chuck E. Cheese or Showbiz Pizza, and a critic even described it as unintentionally terrifying. As an indie developer, this hit Scott pretty hard, and the failure of his previous titles, as well as the incredibly negative feedback, led to him questioning his career as a game developer, and even his faith at times.
Following a bout of depression and experimenting with different jobs, Scott decided to give game development one more earnest attempt, taking the criticisms to Chipper & Sons in mind, and create something that was intentionally terrifying. Did he succeed? Well, that's debatable, but hot damn, people ate this shit up like they were European children during the plague.
And the rest is history. Five Nights at Freddy's was released, and due to the Let's Play renaissance on YouTube, it led to more eyes being on Scott's works than ever before.
But what happened during the Five Nights at Freddy's series development? Are there any pre-release builds or screenshots? You know, what about cut content? Well, for the first 4 games at least, there is a plethora of interesting things to discuss. Starting with the original Five Nights at Freddy's. The first game probably has the most cut and pre-release content of any games in the original series. Infamously, however, there is also a bevy of lost media surrounding the game's early stages of development and promotion. The most famous one is easily the rumored lost trailer for the game. That's existence is kinda shaky.
We could make an entire video on the search and rumors surrounding the supposed lost trailer, but in short, a comment on the popularized Five Nights at Freddy's 1 trailer was left that seemed to suggest that there was an early version with stark differences.
The comment made particular note of changing the animatronic's eyes, which didn't really get elaborated on beyond that. Since the comment's discovery, people have made contact with the original poster, who said,
"There was a previous video up there that had a different, scarier design for the unsuited animatronics, with HAL 9000 style eyes. I suppose it isn't up anymore on Scott's channel, but I remember a few gaming YouTubers making mention of it when it was still on Kickstarter."
Since then, a wild search has happened, which led to the discovery of deleted videos from Scott's Google Plus page. That's like finding a corpse in a graveyard. 2 of these videos did get re-uploaded onto Scott's YouTube channel, but one video remains lost, which was titled Five Nights. For a while, people had speculated that this Five Nights video was the supposed lost trailer. However, since then, OP had backpedaled and admitted to a mistake. In a Twitter reply, he says,
"No, I'm afraid that when I made the first post, I was mistaken, and accidentally recalled the trailer currently up. What I saw was a regular endoskeleton, such as in the background here. My apologies for the confusion."
What OP is referring to with the HAL 9000 eyes was an image that Scott had on the Steam Greenlight page for the game. It was a GIF that had a normal Freddy face that occasionally changes to this image, which depicts an endoskeleton with red eyes. The supposed HAL 9000 eyes also appear in the final trailer for the game, so I'm not really sure what people were looking for here in all honesty.
Now, the search died off there, so there probably isn't a lost trailer, but I'm still curious as to what the deleted Five Nights video contains.
In reality, it's probably just one of the several videos that eventually got re-uploaded to his YouTube channel. But who knows, it could be something amazing, like Freddy in real life! Woo! On an entirely separate note, what exactly was OP on about it with it being on Kickstarter?
Well, for a whole 3 days, Scott had a Kickstarter for the game up, which shares a lot of interesting insight on the game's development.
The most notorious detail surrounds the little flavor text at the top, which reads, "Can you survive the night shift? Watching over Freddy Bear and his friends?" No. This reveals that Freddy's early name was Freddy Bear, which could have gone on to inspire a character down the line, who goes by a very similar name, Fredbear. This early name is still reflected on the game's Steam page to this day. There is another often overlooked aspect to the Kickstarter page, being the backer rewards, which we find particularly interesting.
The $50 tier is not super interesting. It's a simple beta test reward, which sees any backers receive new builds of the game to test every week. And the $25 tier is pretty basic too, being a simple play the game early tier, but the cheapest $10 tier is what piques our interest.
It promises a wallpaper pack, which is a notoriously common Kickstarter award, but it promises 5 wallpapers for any backers. We find this interesting as it isn't really specified if these would simply be renders from the game, like The Office for instance, or entirely unique assets made specifically for the tier. Other than the tiers, the description gives gameplay details which we found to be fascinating. The page reads, "You can only have one door secured at a time," which is incredibly different from the final game, where you can have both doors closed as long as you have enough power. Beyond the non-existent lost trailer and Kickstarter page, there are still a few pieces of lost Five Nights at Freddy's 1 media, most importantly being early builds of the game.
Odds are that these builds don't have many significant changes to them. The earliest one was released on July 25th, when the game was released less than 2 weeks later on August 8th. But they're lost media nonetheless and might contain some unused content not seen in the final game.
There are a total of 3 lost builds. Version 1.0, which was released on July 25th, a demo of version 1.1 released on August 13th, which was a mere 3 days before its release on Steam, in version 1.12's demo and full version. It isn't known exactly when this was released, and it could just not exist for whatever reason, specifically because the earliest version available is version 1.13, so it's entirely possible that Scott could have just screwed up and not released version 1.12, but who knows. Scott has since shared in-development screenshots of Five Nights at Freddy's, showing the process he went through to create the models. This image of Freddy doesn't reveal anything too interesting, except the date in the top right hand corner, which reveals that this model was created on May 28th, 2014. This one shows Chica and has something interesting to note, being that her cupcake is entirely rigged. If you don't know what that means, it means that the model was created with the ability to be animated, something that isn't ever taken advantage of in the final game, as the cupcake is entirely motionless.
These two are in-progress screenshots of Chica and Bonnie's jump scares, and this one shows an image of Foxy giving a double thumbs up.
Yeah!
Interestingly, if you look closely, you can notice that his model is lacking the damage seen in the final game, and more obviously, his hook hand is missing.
The most interesting of these screenshots shows an image of Bonnie lifting his head off to reveal his endoskeleton. What's interesting is his bow tie, which appears here as black instead of the final game's red. Scott has revealed that the tie is black here due to him reusing Freddy's model as a base for Bonnie, which, shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone who's seen the original models. One of the areas that reveals the most changes made between announcement and release are the early trailers and screenshots Scott shared. The teaser trailer displays an insane amount of differences.
Despite this, due to several strange details such as the time counter and power bar's absence, it isn't clear if the differences exhibited here were genuine gameplay alterations, or if it was a result of the trailer being edited. Likewise, the HUD in its entirety is missing from this trailer, which could just be done for clarity's sake, but who knows for sure.
Similarly, camera 1B appears much more zoomed in here than it appears in the final game. Once again though, this could have just been done for the trailer. Most significantly, Bonnie's shown running towards the office, which in the final game is a behavior exhibited only by Foxy. I don't think that this should be used in favor of Foxy not being around at this point. It's important to note that this scene is an animation made specifically for the trailer, much like that of Freddy at the beginning. Needless to say, it'd be foolish to take a pre-rendered animation at face value and assume it's representative of genuine gameplay.
Despite this, Foxy might not have been finalized when this trailer was being made, evident by Scott revealing that he was the most difficult animatronic to pinpoint design-wise. In an interview, he says,
the main three characters, Freddy, Bonnie, and Chica, those designs just kind of, I didn't really plan ahead like what animals they should be. Those three just kind of seemed natural to me for some reason. Mm-hmm. The only one I really struggled with was trying to think of the fourth character, who would be on the separate little stage kind of by himself.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to remember all the options that I originally was kind of debating between. I mean, one of the contenders was a fox, obviously, which ended up winning. The other one was a wolf. Another one was going to be a beaver, but then later I decided against that because I thought that was too on the nose from Chipper, so I decided against that. But yeah, actually, if I remember correctly, I really think that a beaver character was the front runner until I finally decided against him because of Chipper and then went with the fox instead.
The early gameplay similarly shows a ton of minor changes. Camera 4A is incorrectly labeled backstage instead of being called East Hallway. Something similar occurs with camera 4B, which instead of being labeled East Hall Corner is labeled as the West Hall Corner. Beyond that, the most significant change is seen right when the footage begins, which shows an unused lives counter which just doesn't appear in the final game. Lastly, for pre-release material, there are 6 screenshots from IndieDB which show an early build of the game. One of the most notable differences is the lack of a monitor indicator seen at the bottom of the screen, as well as the lack of any text denoting what night you're on. Interestingly, the screenshots look like they were captured using a snipping tool. We can tell this based on the presence of a window bar at the top. And other than that, that covers it for pre-release materials. But left in the game's code are a few pieces of unused, unseen, and unheard content.
The best place to start is with stuff that technically isn't unused rather than being cut off in the final game, the primary example being the jump scare sound effects. The final game has them cut off after a short time, both the standard jump scare sound effect and the Golden Freddy sound effect. We'll play both in their entirety here.
The most boring piece of cut content is easily this. You'll never guess what it was used for.
Obviously the full game.
It's just a leftover from demo builds, absolutely not meant to be used in the final game in any way. Here we have the unused lives counter as seen in the early footage. But alongside this graphic, we have what's presumably an even earlier graphic for this scrapped mechanic.
This is arguably the single most infamous piece of cut content from the entire series, to be honest. This unused shot has all three of the main animatronics staring straight at the camera.
Despite this shot being used in the game's trailer, as well as many people being convinced that they've seen it themselves, there's no code in the game's data that could activate it. And that can only mean one thing. People who said they saw it must be from an alternate dimension.
Or they misremembered. Or they lied.
I have no idea why this was scrapped, to be honest. It would have been spooky as hell. This is the most interesting one to me. It's an unused shot showing the office, but in the monitors you can see reflections that show the back of the room. Now, if this was meant to be used in the game, it makes sense why it was scrapped. If you can see the room's reflection, then where's the player, right? Well, I kinda think that this might have not been meant for the final game at all. Remember the Kickstarter's promised wallpapers? Well, I have a feeling, just an overwhelming feeling, that this would have been one of the promised wallpapers. I have no evidence for this, but I don't know. I'm probably wrong, and what the hell do I know?
This power meter falls into the kinda unused category, as it usually doesn't appear. In the final game, it is only possible to have both doors down and only one light on at once. And once the player pulls the monitor up, the hallway lights automatically turn off. However, it can be seen for a split second before the lights shut off.
This is an incredibly cool piece of cut content, as these early HUD elements reveal potential early angles for the cameras. The camera icons give more specific details, and directly tells the player where the camera is positioned to face, whereas in the final game, we're given no such luxury.
Several differences are clear. The restroom's camera is facing straight down the hallway instead of how it appears angled in the final game.
The show stage camera is positioned against the back wall instead of in front of it, as it seemingly appears in the final game.
Pirate's Cove is further away than in the final game, and the backstage camera was moved to the bottom right.
And finally, the supply closet has a similar change, originally facing towards the back of the room instead of appearing in the top left corner in the final. If I had to guess why these were changed, the art style clashes with the rest of the game's assets. Freddy's is supposed to be a shitty, rundown restaurant, so having a sleek security system UI seems to suggest the exact opposite. Also, I think from a gameplay perspective that these camera angles don't really leave much potential for creepy scenarios. Take the restrooms camera. The final game is at an angle to show the frames of the bathroom in shot. That way you can have lots of potential poses for the different animatronics. They can be shrouded in the shadows of the room, or standing eerily near the camera. It's really well thought out. But here, what would you do with this angle? Your only option is really just to have him, standing in a hallway. It's not super intimidating.
Before we move on, something to point out is that this camera shows the angle of the disabled kitchen camera. This kinda makes me wonder if the kitchen cam was always meant to be disabled, or maybe it was disabled and then given an audio cue due to time constraints, or for gameplay variety?
And finally, yet another uninteresting piece. You'll never guess what this was meant to be used for.
Obviously the full game.
And that about does it for the unused content of Five Nights at Freddy's 1. Despite the uncertain territory in which Five Nights 1 was released, following its success, Scott was determined to continue his game development efforts. Before Five Nights at Freddy's, several games were conceptualized by Scott. A remake of his first substantial title, Flan's Quest, was one heavily considered, as well as a sequel to The Desolate Hope, which he dubbed The Desolate Abandon.
Would he pursue his development aspirations in other series? Or would he capitalize on the sudden popularity of Five Nights? Well, I don't think it comes as a surprise to anyone that in November 2014, Scott released Five Nights at Freddy's 2! Five Nights 2 is my favorite game in the series. It iterates upon everything that was great in the first title and adds its own mechanics to make the game a greater practice in micromanagement, which I find incredibly fun. It gave us loads of new designs, including the design which I find the spookiest and coolest in the series, being Withered Bonnie. Despite a few gameplay mechanics standing out as problematic in their own way, the puppet, I think that this is the most stressful and fun entry in the series. Other than Ultimate Custom Night.
Which is the objective best Five Nights at Freddy's game, no doubt about it.
The build-up between Five Nights 1 and 2 was incredibly short. Scott managed to get the sequel out less than 4 months after the first game, which is an incredible turnaround in any industry. With that in mind, similarly to FNAF 1, Scott seems to have had a pretty clear vision from the start. Following FNAF's meteoric rise in popularity, Scott confirmed that a sequel was in development, and in a Q&A in October, said that scrapped ideas from Five Nights 1 will make their appearance in the sequel.
The question was, do you have any other animatronics planned for Five Nights at Freddy's? To which Scott responded,
some of the ideas that didn't make it into the first game will get to take the stage in the sequel. Beyond the withered and toy animatronics, FNAF 2 only features, well, 2 new animatronics, being the previously mentioned Puppet and Balloon Boy. This interview seems to suggest that both of these were originally planned to make an appearance in FNAF 1, but the full extent of the Balloon Boy and Puppet's implementation into FNAF 1 is unclear. These could have just been ideas that didn't leave the drawing board, or been ideas that he experimented with in-engine prior to their removal. Beyond that, the development of FNAF 2 doesn't really have much publicly known. Odds are, however, based on how quickly the game came out after the first, that it had a pretty clear vision from the start. With that in mind, however, we'd be remiss not to mention the teasers.
To build up to the release, Scott created these pre-rendered teasers to hint at new mechanics, locations, and characters. For the most part, they are identical to the final game. The first teaser clearly just has the final Withered Freddy design. This one still uses the final Withered and Toy Bonnie designs, etc., etc. However, the Mangle teaser isn't quite right.
A lot of people point out that FNAF 1 Foxy's on the left and seem to suggest that he was meant to appear, but I highly doubt it given the fact that the next teaser shows the new Foxy design. What our attention should be drawn to is Mangle on the right, who's shown with a hook which is missing in the final game.
From an in-universe standpoint, Mangle started off as a normal animatronic before getting ripped apart and turned into a building attraction for kids. So I guess the hook was removed from Mangle's design to make it something you could kind of see a parent letting their kid play with.
That covers it for the pre-release era of the game. But much like Five Nights 1, there is a load of interesting things left in the game's data. Let's get the exciting ones out of the way, starting with the Lives and Stickman. They are back, baby, and still not used in the final game. I wouldn't really take this as a suggestion that the Lives mechanic was meant to appear. Odds are that it's just a leftover from Five Nights 1, seeing as it's incredibly likely that this game was directly built off the original.
We also have the string of text that you'll never guess what it was meant for.
The fool.
Could you shut the hell up? Anyways, this is a mere leftover from the game's demo. Then, one of the more interesting ones is this. It shows a weird, seemingly
Wait! I want to talk about this one. Stupid bastard, shows him for telling me to shut up. This graphic is incredibly weird. It's associated with an object called Mike, which has 0 code left over. So what it was originally used for is unclear. A lot of people have drawn attention to this sprite bearing a faint similarity to the Frogget from Undertale, many people even claiming that the unused asset is a mere edit of the Frogget sprite. But further inspection reveals that this is an impossibility. The Frogget sprite is much larger than the Mike sprite, and though they bear a superficial similarity, I think that overall the suggestion that the two are related in some way is simply drawn by FNAF and Undertale having a lot of overlap in terms of fans. Not to mention the fact that Undertale wouldn't be released until a whole year after Five Nights 2's release. That aside, the true use of the sprite remains unknown to this day. This image shows how it's used within the game's code. These symbols were used to track certain AI actions, or certain events. Unfortunately, beyond the tracker, nothing else relating to this weird-ass Mike sprite remains in the final game, so it can really be anything, honestly. A few people speculate that it might have been used to track which part of the office the Night Guard was looking towards, speculating that Mike was a general name for the Night Guard created prior to Jeremy's name being decided. However, there's a theory that I actually agree with that relates to another piece of cut content, being the infamous toxicity meter.
So the toxicity meter is an unused mechanic that was shrouded in mystery for years, until Daco did an interview with Scott and the mechanic was fully detailed. Essentially, the meter would increase the longer the player has the Freddy mask on. Due to the way the Freddy mask functions in-game, being the way to prevent death from a majority of the game's animatronics, this was originally seen as a necessary evil to Scott to dissuade the constant use of the item. As development went on, however, he grew to believe that this was too artificial of a mechanic.
Scott eventually went on to create and modify mechanics specifically to rectify this, such as winding the music box to prevent the puppet from attacking, and Withered Foxy being entirely immune to the mask. The theory surrounding it and Mike having a connection is that perhaps the unused Mike tracker was used to track when the meter was full, as once the meter was full, the player wouldn't have been able to equip the mask for a brief period. This is the theory that I agree with most at the moment. I don't think that the Mike icon was meant to appear during gameplay, clearly based on the drastically different art styles. So perhaps Scott drew something that vaguely represents a skull to indicate that the meter being maxed out likely meant that the player will die? There's still a decent amount of unused content remaining, most notably this unused render of the puppet. It appears that the puppet might have originally been able to appear within the player's office, evident by this render. Though, it is equally possible that it could have been used for one of the game's many hallucinations prior to its removal. This render of Toy Chica was meant to appear when she enters your office. This is something that Toy Bonnie does as well, and Toy Chica exhibiting this behavior would later be seen in Ultimate Custom Night. Interestingly, the code for this to happen is still intact in the game's data, though the way it's programmed means that it'll never appear, pretty much just commenting the behavior out. By changing just a few variables, however, it is possible to re-implement it.
Lastly, for unused content, we have this option which was meant to appear in the Custom Night menu. As you can probably guess, this would have set all the AIs to the maximum difficulty.
Though that covers all of the unused content, there are a few things that, while being used, the player doesn't see or hear in their entirety under normal circumstances. Once again, the animatronics jump scare sound effect is cut off and never heard in its entirety in the game.
Other obscured details are the render of Toy Bonnie when he enters your office, which is obscured due to the mask, and most notably the entire render for JJ's secret appearance. A full look at her render reveals that she doesn't have the pinwheel seen on Balloon Boy, though this decision could have been made just so the render doesn't clip into the desk.
The JJ Easter egg is weird in a lot of ways. A lot of people say that this is a simple recolor of Balloon Boy, but closer inspection reveals that that isn't quite the case. Several details on the design are slightly different from Balloon Boy's, such as this render having much larger eye sockets. Most interestingly, however, if this render was just a basic recolor of Balloon Boy, his smile should be visible at least a tiny bit near the cheek detailing. Over the years, a few people have suggested that this render shows an earlier design for BB that Scott simply forgot to update when he updated BB's design, due to the relative obscurity of the render. There isn't much evidence towards this beyond baseless speculation, and this idea seems to have died out in recent years. But I remember when FNAF 2 was still somewhat new, that I heard this thrown around a lot. That actually does it for unused and obscured content, though we'd like to show two of the most obscure secrets in the game. These secrets are so obscure, in fact, that neither of us have ever seen these ourselves.
The most infamous of these is Shadow Bonnie, who has a literal 1 in a million chance of spawning. He stares at you briefly before making your game crash, but he really doesn't do much beyond that.
If one were to look at the game's code, they'd find that his name is...
Say my name.
Requiescasic. Utter gibberish! It was probably caused by Scott smashing his keyboard or something. Despite this not really being a name, it's since been canonized as his official title in both merchandise and spin-offs.
The other obscure secret is Shadow Freddy, who occasionally appears in parts and service. The exact odds for him aren't known from my understanding, but it appears to be much higher than 1 in a million.
Now that finally covers all the Five Nights 2 info. Following FNAF 2's release and success, how would Scott follow it up? The period following FNAF 2's release is arguably when the series was at its height in popularity online. So would Scott take this opportunity to create something new, or continue what's proven to be a success? Well, take a wild guess. If you thought that the gap between FNAF 1 and 2 was short, you'd be shocked to hear that Scott was able to keep up the pace of his releases for the third entry in the series. Released in March 2015, the game was released to lukewarm reception.
Despite the more middling response, Five Nights at Freddy's 3 marks the point in where the series peaked in terms of online interest, I feel, and the community efforts to discover all the secrets and get to the true ending was an amazing feat to witness.
In terms of development, there isn't really much known about Five Nights 3. Between Scott taking a brief break during the winter of 2014 and wanting to keep this game a mystery prior to its release, not a lot of gameplay footage or screenshots were shared beyond the usual teasers. So there isn't any pre-release info to go off of, really. So with that, we'll jump right into the unused content. Making their grand return, the Lives and Stickman are back, baby! Woo! And they're still unused. Definitely just another carryover from the original title. Then we have this piece of text, which you'll never guess what it was meant for.
I didn't even say anything!
Beyond demo leftovers, the game also has an unused graphic for a 7th night. The 7th night is something that was meant to be used in a custom night mode, as seen in previous entries, yet 3 doesn't actually have a custom night, leaving this unused.
Alongside the 7 night graphics is this green-colored version of Night 2's graphic. In the final game, the only night to use this green text is Night 1, so the purpose of this graphic is unknown. Perhaps all nights were meant to use a green font, seeing as the game features a predominantly yellow and green color palette, but maybe Scott changed his mind?
The question still stands as to why the first night's graphic was left green in the final release. Should it have been a deliberate choice and not an accident? There is also a metric shitload of unused assets relating to the puppet from Five Nights 2.
Perhaps Scott used these sprites as placeholders for the puppet's phantom form? Like, while he was working on the new design, he just used these to test the game mechanics? It could be that, or more likely, they're just leftovers from FNAF 2's project file he forgot to delete.
The game also, once again, has graphics and sound effects that are cut off in the final game. The notorious purple guy sound effect only plays for roughly 3 seconds in the final game, while the recorded sound effect is a full 20 seconds long.
The graphics that are partially cut off aren't too significant. This render of Springtrap standing and peering into the player's window is cut off below the waist in the final game, and this render of Phantom Mangle is similarly cut off around halfway for the same reason.
The funniest of the obscured graphics is hands down this render of Springtrap as he walks past your window. His legs are idle as they're cut off in the final game, but as a result the fully ripped asset looks simply outrageous.
We saved the most substantial piece of unused content for last, being the seal vent button. In the final game, the player seals vents by double tapping the respective camera option, which leaves this as an unnecessary asset that was likely removed to declutter the UI a tad.
And that wraps up the unused content of Five Nights 3. Originally intended to be the final game in the series, Scott was about to move on and develop something brand new. You know, if it weren't for the fact that Springtrap's jump scare left him and the general gaming public dissatisfied. This led to him deciding to start work on the 4th, final, and hopefully scariest game in the series, Five Nights 4. FNAF 4 is simultaneously the coolest and lamest game in the series. The change in location is exciting, and I think that a lot of the designs are cool, but it loses the subtlety to the horror seen in the first 2 titles.
This is an issue present in 3 as well, but FNAF 4 takes it to a whole new level and gives everyone enough teeth to make a Requiem shark blush.
Some of the animatronic designs are pretty scary, like Nightmare Chica, while others are too exaggerated for me to find them genuinely horrifying, like obviously Nightmare Fredbear and his subsequent reskin, Nightmare. Then there's the most problematic design, Nightmarionette, who looks super fucking scary in the first teaser Scott shared of him, but looks stupid as hell in the full game. Personal qualms with the game aside, FNAF 4 is home to a lot of cut content, and is home to one of the most infamous pieces of cut content in recent years, being the notorious box.
We could dedicate an entire video to the utter insanity surrounding the race to open FNAF 4's box. It was probably the most ravenous the fans had gone surrounding a secret.
Once you complete the game and get the true ending, this box with 2 locks shows up, and you're unable to open it. After screwing with it a little bit, text appears above it saying, "Perhaps some things are best left forgotten. For now," before it fades to black. In the original release of the game, it was entirely impossible to open the box. No assets for an open version existed at the time until the Halloween update dropped on, Hanukkah Halloween, and added functionality to have the locks removed. Despite the functionality being added, and it should appear once the player defeats the hardest difficulty on Custom Night, upon beating it in the final game, it immediately warps the player to the title screen, leaving this unused. Since then, the contents of the box haven't been revealed or even really remotely hinted at by Scott.
When asked, Scott usually responds with the claim that it contains the pieces of the story, all pieced together, which really doesn't clarify anything, frankly. He revealed that he had full intentions of the box being opened at some point, evident by unused assets in the subsequent spin-off, Five Nights at Freddy's World, existing showing the box actually opening, but he eventually decided to abandon the idea.
Why was the idea abandoned? Well, it turns out that Scott wanted the community to solve the story of the games themselves, rather than being given the answers outright. And he was waiting for someone to get it right before he finally confirmed it. But as days turned to weeks, and weeks into months, and no one was able to solve it, Scott decided it'd be best to abandon the idea. The story of the Five Nights series gets more and more confusing with every new release, so I doubt we'll ever learn what was meant to be in the box. The contents have changed over the years. Scott admits that himself.
Obviously, I watch all the game theory videos, and me and Matt have sometimes had an antagonistic relationship back and forth. I inconvenience him with my games, and sometimes he inconveniences me with his theories. But it's all in good fun. But I'll tell you, he did a video on that box, and he kind of said that he thinks the contents of the box changed over the years. And I bet nobody gave that a whole lot of thought, but I saw that and I was like, he's absolutely right. He's absolutely right. The contents of that box have changed over the years because, it's for that very reason. It's because, of what I was intending the game to be when it happened. And then after the reaction of it, I was like, I need to craft this into something better for the people who see this as important. And that kind of indirectly does change the contents of the box, because it changes the contents of everything that came before. So I thought that was an interesting observation on his part.
And though I don't think we'll ever figure out what the box contained, I still hope that one day Scott finally reveals it just so we can know about the original intention.
Now, if you thought that was interesting, hold on to your pants, because you are not going to believe the remaining pieces of cut content from Five Nights 4.
What?
Yeah, to say that Five Nights at Freddy's 4 has cut content is a bit of an exaggeration, as beyond the box and the demo leftovers, there is a single animation showing a spinning star. That's it.
Okay, not really. There are a few more pieces, albeit none all too interesting. This unused graphic shows the word chapter, and based on the art style it was likely meant to be used across the game's minigame intermissions before being scrapped. It's likely it would have been used to signify the progress of the story. For instance, Intermission 1 is Chapter 1, Intermission 2 is Chapter 2, etc.
The game was originally titled Five Nights at Freddy's The Final Chapter before Scott decided to drop the subtitle, replacing it with the simple 4, so it was probably around this time that the chapter denotation was dropped for the minigames.
Most depressing of all, there exists code for Plush Fredbear in the minigames to have its nose honk like the other Freddy Easter eggs in the rest of the series. However, due to the game making the player's cursor disappear during the minigames, as well as the hitbox warp being placed out of bounds, this functionality goes unused.
And that covers it for FNAF 4 cut content, and honestly everything I wanted to discuss today.
The rest of the series, as in from FNAF World to Security Breach, has a lot of cut content to discuss too. But due to the sheer size of some of the later entries, cut content, and the fact that they essentially take place in a separate continuity, it felt best to end today's video here.
Yeah, so we'll probably come back to visit the later games in a future video. So if that interests you, just keep an eye out. Until then, thank you for watching. You know, how'd you do that? Like, become invisible and stuff? No, please! I don't want to die! No!